Keep on pushing. Keep on pushing. I've got to keep on pushing.
Mr. Hasdovic's online lecture series, lecture number 14, The Expansion of the Modern Civil Rights Movement. As we've learned, it's a mistaken assumption that the civil rights movement began in the 1950s. We've not only seen frequent examples of how people's civil rights were oppressed throughout our country's history, but also how different groups of people responded and fought to attain civil equality. It's also a mistake to connect only African Americans with the civil rights movement. Civil rights are the powers, protections, and immunities all citizens possess. Any group of people who fought to attain equality in these regards were people who fought for their civil rights. The 1950s and 60s, however, were landmark years for the African American quest for civil rights because these years won tremendous victories for blacks against both de facto and de jure racism and segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were immensely important legal victories for all Americans, won principally by black activists. The efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. to change the hearts and minds of Americans regarding race set up a blueprint for how to not only expose prejudice, but for how to change it. Other oppressed groups would use these legal victories and strategies to wage their own campaigns for civil rights, and just as blacks found the 50s and 60s to be years of vital change, other peoples striking out for civil rights would build upon those victories for themselves in the 60s and 70s and beyond. The 1950s and 60s weren't the beginning of the civil rights movement, nor the end, but they were a period in time in which many different groups of people across America would make tremendous gains in reaching for the goal of civil equality. In tonight's lecture, we look at a few select groups' quests for equality, how their movement was influenced by the gains made by blacks, and the significance of some of the victories they achieved. The women's movement. In 1943, Betty Friedan had spent a year pursuing a PhD in psychology at UC Berkeley when she began to feel the pressure to give up advanced academic studies in order to take up a more traditional feminine role as she and her boyfriend pursued matrimony. After marriage, Friedan found the American dream of living in upper-class suburbs, caring for healthy, happy children and her husband, rather unfulfilling. She began to question some of her fellow classmates beginning in 1957 and found they all shared this great feeling of discontent despite having what many would consider an ideal life. Friedan then wrote a book released in 1963 called The Feminist Mystique, describing the problem that had no name. In writing this book, Friedan relied upon her training in psychology and stated, quote, "The problem lay buried, unspoken. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, she was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all?" The Feminist Mystique was an instant bestseller when released in 1963, and millions of women answered the question, is this all, with a resounding no. Many women, especially in the middle class, felt that their education, their talents, and their intelligence was going to waste in a life of domesticity. They sought intellectual challenge and craved a life of meaning beyond cleaning house and cooking meals. And in the 1950s and early 1960s, women of all colors found an opportunity for this outlet in the African American struggle for civil rights and equality. Diane Nash was only a 22-year-old English student at Fisk University when she helped to found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that is SNCC, which would become the youth wing of the civil rights movement, holding sit-ins across the South. At the age of 26, Nash led the Freedom Riders directly into the heart of Southern segregation and violence. Nash was asked by President Kennedy to sit in on the committee that would draft the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A quick study of her life makes me feel like I pretty much wasted my 20s. Ella Baker worked behind the scenes and in direct leadership from the 1930s through her death in 1986 with the NAACP, CORE, the SCLC, and SNCC. Rosa Parks, a woman whose name is synonymous with the civil rights movement as Martin Luther King's is, was active in the NAACP. She was elected secretary, ironically, because she was the only woman in her chapter. She became a leader in the Montgomery bus boycott. Shirley Chisholm was inspired by the civil rights movement to get involved in New York politics as a member of that state's legislature. In 1968, she would go on to become the very first black woman to serve in Congress, and later, the first black woman to run for president. Arguably the most crucial victory black civil rights activists won, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was also a crucial victory for women. This act prohibited discrimination not simply based on race, religion, and national origin, but also based upon gender. This meant that sexual discrimination was illegal. By 1966, however, many women nationwide felt that the Civil Rights Act was not being adequately enforced. That same year, 28 women, including Friedan and Shirley Chisholm, organized the National Organization for Women, also known as NOW. NOW would organize women to put pressure on politicians to enforce the 1964 Civil Rights Act, support the election of female politicians, and help communities organize everything from rape crisis to daycare centers. Before 1970, NOW claimed over 175,000 members and encouraged other women's organizations to sprout up around the nation, all with different agendas. Some of these were strictly political. Others labored for divorce rights for women. Still others lobbied for stronger sentences for violent crimes like rape against women, while others worked for protecting women's reproductive rights. One particularly radical group, the New York Radical Women, launched an infamous protest of the 1968 Miss America pageant which would forever haunt all women's rights and feminist movements thereafter. Protesting the objectification and overt sexualization of women, the New York Radical Women crowned a sheep as Miss America and proceeded to throw girdles, wigs, makeup, and, most infamously, bras into burning trash cans. This one act, the only recorded act of women ever burning bras, would forever after brand all feminists as bra burners. Gloria Steinem was a journalist who first made headlines in 1963 with an investigative report over how Playboy magazine abused its female employees, the bunnies, at their nightclubs. In 1971, she organized the National Women's Political Caucus with Friedan and Chisholm, as well as lawyer and political activist Bella Abzug. In 1972, she founded Ms. Magazine, designed to address modern political and social issues directly relevant to women. Its first edition sold over 300,000 copies within its first 3 days. By the early 1970s, it had seemed that the women's rights movement, now also dubbed the feminist movement, had attained national attention and publicity, legal support through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and a talented and diverse leadership. In the 1970s, feminists would face their biggest tests and challenges, however, as both the battle for control over pregnancy would come to a zenith, as would the effort to insert an amendment to the Constitution banning sexual discrimination would also reach its apex.